This week, Rick Clunn will examine how to approach a new lake in a pre-tournament situation in depth. Then Rick will bisect the situation in today's art of angling. But up first, Kevin VanDam has some great tips on how to use a drop shot rig.
Oh yeah. There is nothing like a drop shot to catch him. It's not just a deep water technique. I mean, I'm using it right now in about 6-8 foot of water, just up on a flat. I mean, there's not a rig that I've got that gives my bait more action. Shake your little worm and he's gonna eat it. That's a nice one. You know, I've got just a little 1/4 ounce drop weight on there right now. I got a little number 2 hook and I've just got a straight-tailed worm just nose hooked through there. That has unbelievable action in the water. I missed him. I missed him again. Got him. Oh, man. Just not for deep water. I mean, there's nothing that limits it. You just kind of shake it along. And in clear water like this, I'm going to use it on spinning equipment. But in dirtier water, you know, you don't be afraid to throw heavier line and heavier tackle. You know, I like the control that I get with a spinning rod in the feel. With that drop shot, to me, it's just almost a must to use fluorocarbon. The fluorocarbon gives you the sensitivity that you need. It gives you the sink rate, and especially when the water's clear like this, the fish just can't see it. When you look right now, the sky is high and bright. There's not a ripple out here. Water's crystal clear, and I'm catching big smallmouth. All I'm using today is a little number 2 drop shot hook, and I'm fishing it rigged exposed. And it's important to make sure that the hook is standing straight up. So you always want to go from the point side when you're tying it, and not just tie a Palomar knot with a lot of extra line, and that'll give you your leader. But for like what I'm doing here, when I'm casting this bait out and dragging it, I want a short leader. That way, as I'm pulling it along, that bait is just above the bottom. So I like the long cylinder shaped weight there. It pulls through the vegetation or thick rocks a lot better. If I'm just fishing clean bottom, there's nothing better than tungsten. One thing I've really learned though this past season in fishing this bait a lot is that you gotta use a sinker heavy enough to keep good bottom contact. You know, if you're not hitting the bottom with a 1/4 ounce, then you wanna, you know, put on a 3/8. And just keep moving up in weight until you get good bottom contact. I usually fish it with my finger right on the line. And when you get a strike on it, you'll feel that strike, and don't set the hook right away. You just want to reel and let the rod load. This little needle sharp hook will hook them up every single time if you don't jerk. The key on a good drop shot rod though is having one that has a fast tapering tip to it. I like one with a little backbone because a lot of times I'm making real long casts and things with it, but the tip itself is pretty soft. And most of the bend in this rod is going to be in the first third. There's a lot of different baits you can use on a drop shot, but I can tell you my favorite without a doubt is just a 4-inch 3X finesse worm. This one's made by Stacey King. Just nose hook it like that and it just quivers like uncontrollable. Another good way to rig it is wacky style, where you can hook it right in the middle, and it has a tremendous amount of action that way too. A tube is another one of my favorites. Anytime that I think that they're really feeding on bait fish, you know, shad, perch, things like that, I'll use a tube. As long as there's not a lot of cover that you're fishing, this exposed hook is the way to go. If it's thicker, go ahead and do the same thing and rig it with a Texas rig. There's not a lot to it. Just tie on a hook, put on a drop shot weight, put your favorite bait on there, got it, and you're in business.
How would you approach a lake you've never been on before? What would you do if it were tournament practice? Today, Rick Clunn answers these questions as we go in depth.
Here we are at Lake Amstead in Del Rio, Texas, for the very first Elite Series event, BAS event of the year. These fish are moving up on the beds. We're going to continue to have the new moon. We'll also be going into some 80-degree weather days, which is just going to encourage them to move up more and more every day, probably on the beds. The problem is we've had a lot of wind, so we hadn't been able to really see as many of the beds as we would if it'd be calm. But when you're in between looking for beds, we need search baits. And what I mean by that is the bait while I'm running a bank, I'm throwing out in the middle, or I'm throwing it parallel to the bank. And my primary bait's probably going to be a trickster spinnerbait, half-ounce plus, with about a number 4 long drop blade on it. I'll put a Lucky Strike ringworm on the back of it. Same bait I was actually throwing in the Classic. There we go. And this lake is probably as good a lake there is in the country right now. It's just, I mean, it's a ball. You can catch fish just all day long on the majority of baits, which is, you know, from a recreational standpoint is great. From a tournament standpoint, that size fish is not going to do much good. In fact, if you probably don't have a 5-pound average in this lake, you're not even going to be in the top, 10. You're looking for beds. You're looking for those key big fish. And so you try to develop some in-between baits so you're not just doing nothing in between. Search bait, though, that primary search bait probably, if we have the wind, will be the spinner bait. And normally I work this when the spinner bait when the cover is real thick. Now when I've got sparse cover, the other bait I would be used, especially if the sun comes out and it gets a little calmer, would be the jerk bait. I'm choosing a pretty large jerk bait. This is a Lucky Craft jerk bait, mainly to try to encourage bigger fish. The final bait I would use is a search bait, and this is where you got some deep troughs and not a lot of cover. You've got some hydrilla in these troughs down, that's in the middle of these troughs, would be the Orion, deep Orion. Yeah, this morning before the sun gets high, where you can't really see the beds real well, I'm really fishing for still out on the main lake area, trying to find some pre-spawn fish. Kind of think in terms of in the pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn I try to visualize this whole lake was a month ago was solid ice, top to bottom, bank to bank. And then if you think about how the ice melts, this lake would melt, the warmer areas melt first, which is back in your pocket, so it melts from the bank out, okay, because that's shallower water, sun hits it, it melts faster. The deeper water out here in the middle is it's like a big ice cube, it's gonna melt the slowest. So the water out here stays colder longer. So these fish are out in the middle of the lake will be the last ones to spawn. First ones to spawn are normally on your north and your west pockets and your real protected pockets, because the sun is kind of in the southern hemisphere this time of year, so those banks get the most exposure. Then that's what I'll do. I really pay attention to how a lake warms up. Before I started really committing to bed fishing, when I'm fishing kind of what I call pre-spawn fish that are moving into a big flat that they're going to spawn in, or big pockets, area where it's a major spawning area, there's key areas they tend to hold. We call them staging areas. These fish, let's imagine they're moving into this big pocket, and you've got points coming out. And the creek channel winds through this cove and comes by some of these points. And one of them we refer to is called an elbow. In other words, the elbow is just like the elbow that you would have in your arm. And these fish will not be out on the end of the point, and especially if there's a creek channel that comes through there, bends through there, that's going to be a key staging point. They'll hold there before they move up, and then on the way back out, they'll hold there again. Yeah, this is going to be more typical of these little bays and coves and pockets where they're now moving up pretty strong to spawn. Even though I'll still throw a lot of in-between baits in here because it's still the light's pretty low. All you're going to see right now are the absolutely shallowest beds, and actually the bigger fish will bed on your deeper beds. And those in this lake, due to the clarity, are probably sitting in anywhere from 6 to 15 foot. And so with this low light, it's hard. I'm not good enough to see those kind of beds. The thing about the real shallow beds, everybody can see those, so those fish get picked off pretty fast. It's those little bit deeper beds that are hard to see that you've got to work to find. It's another good reason to take your kids fishing with you, because they got those young eyes. Plus, that's why I brought my nephew with me. He's about, what are you, 6'4"?
6'4".
Yeah. So height helps too. There's the girl. If you think they're just beginning to spawn, I won't just exclusively fish for bedfish, but I'm also fishing what I call in-between fish. Fish that can be caught other ways. So while you're looking for beds, you're still not wasting all that time. You have a good chance of catching fish at the same time you're looking for fish. Yeah, that's the size you gotta have. Believe it or not, you gotta have 5 of those every day. See, that's one of those in-between fish that you need, especially when you got conditions like this and you're only seeing about 1/10 of the beds that are here. Ooh, right at the cameras. If you're bed fishing, you want to stay in the clearer part of the lake. And that's normally the lower ends of the lake. And this lake, most of it's clear because they haven't had any rain. But normally, if you're bed fishing, that's obviously you want the maximum visibility in the areas you're fishing. In the beginning, it's going to take a lot of effort to find this kind of water. Then it pays off year after year, because these fish are kind of like salmon. They go back to the same areas year after year after year to spawn. You have a good chance of catching fish at the same time you're looking for fish. I like to use faster baits, obviously, because you are going to be moving fairly fast on the troll motor. Working top waters, working spinner baits. A lot of times a top water, a spinner bait work fast will show you an area, a fish will come up on it and swirl. And if you miss this, a lot of times he came off a bed.
I like to determine as much as I can about the conditions I'm going to be faced with in tournament practice before I ever get on the water. You know, one key thing to look at is water temperature. The way to get these numbers is by looking on the internet or by calling someone at a local marina. This will give you a general idea of whether the fish are going to be in a pre-spawn, spawn, or a post-spawn situation. If you'll look these numbers up, you'll be way ahead of the game.
That fish is looking at it right now. He's catchable. I don't know how much time you'd have to spend on him, unfortunately. Now, when you're looking for the bed itself, what it is, it's like if you just had a little dust, a little brush, just brushed away, and there's maybe a few shiny rocks in one area. A lot of times, that's all you'll see. When looking at him, it's probably 2.5 to 3, somewhere in there. But until we catch him, you never know for sure. Your bait has to go where potentially that fish has put its eggs or it's going to put its eggs, because that's what it's going to defend. It's not going to defend the whole area. It's going to defend that little shiny area where it intends to lay its eggs. See, because there's times I look at him, he doesn't look as big. But then there's times when he looks like he... More important than your eyes is polarized sunglasses. And this is really where you need to bite the bullet and buy expensive sunglasses. If you really want to be serious about bed fishing, it's your window into that underwater world, and cheap ones are just not going to work as well. Yeah, he's probably 2 3/4 to 3, somewhere in there. I need to bring that's the problem in this lake, you need to bring a scale so you can really know these fish exactly. This is a gorgeous area we're in. These big flats, perfect for largemouth. Big flats and protected because you come through a little narrow inlet and come into this kind of open bay, which is obviously going to warm up fairly quick because it's protected from the main lake. One of the primary baits I'm going to use will be a lizard. This is a Bass Pro Shop laminated lizard. I'm using a bright color because I want to be able to see it down there on that bed in 8 to 10 foot of water. I want to be able to see where my bait at. And that's so important in catching those big fish, is getting that bait on the right spot on the bed. If that doesn't work and the fish are a little bit timid, then what I will go to is a 6 to 7 inch trick worm. Just put it on a shaky head jig. The final bait I'm going to use is probably like a jogger worm, basically a Cinco type bait. And I'm going to Texas rig it with a 16th ounce, 8th ounce sinker. I'll use this on the beds, but I'll also use this if it gets dead calm and they quit hitting that spinnerbait and jerkbait. And I basically then use this as a search bait, firing out to trees and stuff that I was throwing the spinnerbait and jerkbait at, and just working it slower on the dead calm, bright days. Oh, but there's a nice one too. We've kind of talked about the type of areas to look for in the lake, the type of areas that warm up first, what the beds look like, the strategies about locating the beds, the different strategies. Yeah, I think that's a little bigger than that first one I caught, I think so. That looks like a good 5, solid 5, 5.5. We've talked about kind of the different stages of the actual spawn going on and when the fish are aggressive. We've talked about in-between fish. So that's really what I wanted to do. I want to give you the confidence that once you embrace it and you understand it and you learn it, then it's really probably the easiest form of fishing there is, especially to put lunker fish in the boat. Never gets old. Every fish is almost like the first one you ever caught all over.
These new bladed jigs have become one of the hottest lures on the tour. The great thing about them is they give off a tremendous amount of vibration, and they're different than anything the bass has ever seen. You can throw them in real heavy cover, and this little blade wiggles in front of the bait, and it's like a crankbait, a spinnerbait, and a jig all in one, and they've just never seen it. It's one of my favorite new baits.
Up next, Rick Clunn is back. He offers his unique thoughts on how to interpret fishing areas. It's this week's Art of Angling.
You know, historically, fishermen have always been accused of being liars. I think somewhat that's exaggerated. Especially today, I think really it's more that they misinterpret what they've done, what they've, have figured out, what they've caught. Maybe they've embellished it a little bit. I will give you some examples of that in a minute, but also I want to share with you probably one of the most important concepts that I've learned about bass fishing, and that's what we call pattern fishing. Pattern fishing is basically if you're fishing an area, and let's say a small pond, and you fish around and you fish different types of habitat. You fished aquatic vegetation for a while, lily pads, you fish rock, riprap on the dam, and all of a sudden you came through over by these stumps and you catch your first bass of the day. The definition of pattern fishing says all the bass in a given area in a given time period are doing the same thing, and it's incredibly accurate. It's shockingly accurate, matter of fact. So following that definition, for me now to catch another bass, all I got to do is throw back to that same stump or find another one just like it. But here's where the interpretation comes in. A stump is rarely a concentration fish. One object rarely holds very many fish. So that's probably an individual fish pattern, which means you have to move and you have to duplicate it. So it requires a lot of work. Cranking your engine, using your troll motor, finding another stump, and that's the way it works all day long. Okay, now the opposite of that is a concentration of fish pattern. And a concentration of fish pattern is simply like an aquatic vegetation under the water, maybe an acre or two of it. That object or that type of habitat will hold a tremendous amount of fish. So there, that you might be dealing with a concentration fish pattern. And again, to distinguish the difference, with it, you don't have to necessarily duplicate it. Now the definition of a pattern says all the fish in a given area and a given time frame are doing the same thing, still holds, but now you don't have to move because you're on a concentration of fish. So, and you don't necessarily have to duplicate it. You can catch fish there that day, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day until you get an extreme change in conditions. To avoid lying to yourself, you got to get very good at knowing the difference between an individual fish pattern and a concentration fish pattern. Really stop, take a deep breath, figure out, is this an individual fish pattern or is this a concentration fish pattern? Then you'll be more apt to interpret what you found more accurately.